Hi, I'm Mikey Domagala, and you're watching episode 14 of Inside Buzz. On this episode, we have Israel Gutierrez, a longtime ESPN reporter who could be seen on shows like Around the Horn and Highly Questionable. For all young journalists watching, take in Israel's advice. I listened very closely, and I'm going to take a lot from this interview because he answered tons of questions about the field. He spent over 20 years in the field. Currently he's with ESPN, does some stuff for the NBA as a sideline reporter, but he's also worked for the Miami Marlins and the Miami Heat. So tons of high-pressure situations that he's been in that we could all learn from. Israel, welcome to the show, and thanks for taking the time.
Hey, thanks, man. No problem.
How's quarantine going in Florida, and what kind of jobs have you been doing for ESPN and the companies you work for?
Work-wise, that's been probably the weirdest part, having to do everything from home. Initially, ESPN just started sending, some lights and some tripods and everything, and we all just kind of figured out how to do these shows from home, and it's been challenging. I think more so because of the topics, not necessarily because of the technology or anything. But it's been challenging, but I think I think we're all sort of waiting to get back to the studios.
And Israel, one of those topics for the NBA, the return for the bubble in Orlando in late July. Do you know any reporters who are going there and the circumstances they're going to be under? And were you asked?
We still don't know, basically, is the short answer. There's a limit as to how many people can be there and be there in certain tiers and what have you. There's just a lot of things that are still to be worked out. Fortunately, for the players and the teams, that kind of stuff has been worked out. For us, we're just sort of filling the gaps, if you will. And so it could be where it very well could be that I'm going. I'm sort of got it in my mind where I am, but that they only know games. Maybe they do broadcasting some games from home as a possibility. I don't know that if that's the case. That I haven't really shared that. The whole point being is, we'll know relatively soon, but it's still a work in progress.
And Izzy, let's jump right into your career. Take me through how you started, how you got your interest, and now, a little more than 20 years later, how you got to ESPN.
It's funny because, being in high school, it's funny how I've been thinking about this lately, just how life just kind of takes you where it takes you. And I remember when I was going into high school, it was 10th, 11th, and 12th grade here. So there was no 9th grade freshman year. That was in junior high. And so I get into going into 10th grade, and I wanted to really be in a class with my older sister, who was 2 years older than me. So it was her senior year. And the only class we could figure that out for was the yearbook class. And so, like I said, I've never really been the most social person, right? So school was always kind of my main focus. And so it just so happened that in a lot of things that I did, whether it be yearbook, whether it be debate club, whether it be like senior class stuff, like if I got involved at all, I ended up sort of being in charge. And so my sophomore year, I was just in the class, like I said, just to kind of be in a class with my older sister. And then by the next year, I was already editor-in-chief, and then I was editor of the next year after that. And so that's what sort of sparked my journalistic interest because, to be honest, I wanted to be a lawyer. And that's why I did the debate thing and all that stuff. And I was, pretty decent at it, and still think I would have been a pretty good trial lawyer. But when I got to Florida, at the University of Florida, I still hadn't really fully decided. But I just decided that I feel like I would have been successful in whatever field I decided to go into. And so I just decided on one that would be fun. And so I went into journalism. And even then, I didn't entirely say, okay, it's sports journalism until like going into my junior year. And that's when I realized that, I hated covering, county courts for my reporting class and all this other stuff. And I was like, this is not really in my future. And so I looked and I asked around. I took a sports reporting class, they were offering my junior year. And there was a couple guys in there that were in the student newspaper that I recognized. And so I asked one of them, you might know him, Jamie Eisenberg from CBS Fantasy Sports. He does fantasy football.
I know Jamie, yep.
Yeah, I asked him, hey, can you show me how to start the works for the Alligator, which is the name of the student newspaper. And he just took me literally, I think right after that class, took me over to the building and introduced me to some people. And, they gave me my first assignment, and it was off from there. And a couple of semesters into that, I was working for some newspapers across the state, doing some freelancing, and for the Associated Press as well. And I got an internship right after that. And then going into my last semester at Florida, I stayed an extra half semester because I wanted to cover the football team. I just got a job right before I graduated, a job offer right before I graduated at the Palm Beach Post. And that was crazy because, even back then, this was 1999, even then, newspapers were struggling, and, all of my friends had all anticipated, getting a job somewhere other than anywhere they wanted to, and then having to work their way up. And so for me to get a job at the Palm Beach Post, which was, 35 minutes, maybe 45 minutes north of where I grew up, it's crazy. It was crazy. And even crazier, like 3 weeks into it, they gave me the Marlins beat, which is, what? I was 22 years old.
Yeah, especially as a young kid.
I remember going in, and it was, I think it was literally my first day. And Dave O'Brien, he's now at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, but he was at the South Florida Sun-Sentinel at the time. He said, I remember he asked me how old I was, and I said 22. And I was like, and then I think I said something smart alecky, like I turned 23 in 2 months. And he said, yeesh, whatever happened to paying your dues? And I kind of just listened to that, and I just kind of giggled. I was like, cool, I don't have to do that, I guess. And so I did that for a year, and then toward the end of that season, our Miami Heat beat writer, Ethan Skolnick, was going to the Miami Herald, so he was leaving the paper. And so, that had been my dream. I remember leaving school, and one of my professors had asked me where I wanted to be in 10 years. And I said, hey, in 10 years, I'd love to be, covering a NBA team for a major metro newspaper. And it just so happened that I started in October of 2000, which was 10 months after I graduated. So that was, it was kind of crazy. And I did that for 2 years, and then got hired by the Miami Herald for the same job. And then did that for a handful of years, and then got bumped up to being a sports columnist. And then a certain guy named LeBron James came to town. And I was still a columnist at the Heralds for the 2010-2011 season. And then if you remember that 2011-2012 season, that was a lockout to start. And so it didn't actually start until December. And that was maddening for me, because I was sort of in this weird game, because ESPN wanted to hire me. .com had finally wanted to hire me for the right job. Like, I'd been asked to do a couple of other jobs for ESPN, didn't really fit what I wanted to do. And then they asked, hey, do you want to be an NBA columnist for us? At the time, I'm sure you know J.A. Adande. At the time, he was writing columns still, and he was living out west in L.A., and they sort of pitched it as an East Coast version of J.A. Adande, of course, with me being down in the center of the basketball universe, which was Miami at the time, which is crazy, because even though I took that job and started doing that, like, it was such a big deal, the Heat, that they just kept flying people in to write columns, and it was like Mike Wilbon, Stephen A. Smith, Brian Windhorst, and I'm just sitting here like, I live here. Like, why can't I just do all this?
Yeah, I got you.
But that's what my point is that's how big, that era was. Like, it didn't matter. We couldn't have enough. It was, all of us were writing. And so, I finally just took that job in 2012 because I was sitting there waiting. They wanted to hire me in October, but there wasn't an NBA season, so they couldn't do that yet. So I didn't even know when I should quit the Miami Herald, because I knew it was like just a matter of time. I ended up just guessing, and I went like 2 weeks where I didn't have a job at all, and that was kind of nuts. But yeah, that's when so I've been with the ESPN ever since. And when I got there, I was doing a lot of writing, and still doing some TV, and still doing Around the Horn, and at the time the Sports Reporters, and but it was mostly centered around the writing. And then I started doing some sideline reporting, I think in 2013, a year later. And then slowly the writing sort of drifted, because our staff just increased, and they didn't really need like the hot take column, or they didn't want all that stuff. And so, now I'm doing mostly that, is the NBA sidelines and Around the Horn and HQ, and, wherever they need me. And I'm trying to work on, individual personal projects as well.
So how was the transition from mostly being a columnist and writing all day and stuff like that to being more in the public eye and on television?
It's weird, because, growing up, I remember reading a lot of like Dan Le Batard. I read and I don't think people do this necessarily today, but I was at the time still very much distinguishing between the columnist and the beat writers. Because I remember a guy by the name of Steve Weiss, who covers the NFL now. He was the Miami Heat beat writer that I was reading when I was in high school, but I would always read Le Batard, and Greg Cody and Linda Robertson for the columns. And for some reason, I never really thought of myself as a columnist. I never thought of myself as like quick-witted or like great with words necessarily, which is, I guess crazy because nobody ever told me I was a talented writer until I was actually writing for a living, which is weird. And so I remember reading them and never really thinking I would be a columnist. I remember thinking, covering a team is cool. And I'd get to be around the NBA all the time. I think that was probably what was drawing me. I just love basketball more than anything. And I wanted to be around that particular sport. And I'd be okay if it was football or if it was, baseball or anything else or golf or tennis. But basketball is what I really loved. That's kind of what I wanted to do. I never wanted to be in television. At the time, there weren't, outside of watching SportsCenter at night and, listening to the anchors and stuff, I don't remember ever saying, hey, I want to be like that guy, And so it never crossed my mind. And then I remember when I became a columnist in 2007, very soon thereafter in 2008, I got a call from Joe Valerio, who was a producer of the Sports Reporters, and asked me to do the show. And I remember I couldn't because I had to go to Beijing to cover the Olympics. But as soon as I got back, I was like, of course, I'd be more than happy to. And it was really surreal. At the time they filmed it at the ESPN zone in Times Square. And it was just a really musty, old smell. Like it smelled exactly like you would think a bar would at 6 a.m. They had some like really stale, like not stale, they were decent bagels, but just bagels and orange juice there. And it was a makeup artist, but like the lights weren't very good. So I remember doing this and thinking like, wow, this is as good as it gets. This is Mike Lupica. This is Mitch Albom. This is, I don't even know who else was on there. And I thought, it went really well. I liked the experience and I could see myself doing that in that sort of professional setting. And then Around the Horn came along and added a little dose of fun to it. And I've never seen myself, I guess in a roundabout way to ask your question, I've never seen myself as being the voice of a fan base or a voice of sports. I've always thought an information giver. And so this twist it's been fun. It's been sort of gratifying and like sort of makes that time, even though it didn't feel like that long of a time, that decade plus that I spent, almost 2 decades writing, that it sort of created this track record and people, credibility, and people actually, listen to what you have to say and they respect it. And I think that is sort of a cool twist that I never really anticipated.
And what are some like top career moments that you've had where you said, oh wow, I'm really in this position? I heard you talking about the Olympics, Beijing, but what about like certain spots you've reported at, certain interviews that you've had?
Yeah, there's a couple that come to mind, and you mentioned Beijing. That's almost always the first one that comes to mind, and not just because it was Beijing, but there was one particular time. I went to the Great Wall of China once by myself, and then I went a second time, and that second time I happened to be with Dwayne Wade, Chris Paul, Derek Williams, and just a handful of NBA players, and I was up there talking to Dwayne Wade for a lot of it, and that was crazy. On top of one of the world's greatest monuments with, at the time in this 6th year, like one of the greatest players in the game, and just a guy that I had covered and watched. It was kind of a weird situation because, I sort of grew up as a writer about the same time as Dwayne did. And, he reached this crazy pinnacle, obviously. And I just felt like, wow, it was just it's one of those moments that it just hits you right away. It's like, wow, this isn't something that everybody gets to do, I remember another time this was in 2005 when Shaq had gotten traded to Miami. A couple of the beat writers were, asked to, meet him at the pool at the Mandarin Oriental, I think it was, because he was doing a Sports Illustrated photo shoot, and then he would just do one-on-one interviews with each of us, one after the other. And while we were doing our interview, like, we had put our feet in the pool because he was sitting there. He was actually in the pool, so I just, rolled up my pant legs and put my feet in the pool. And at one time, he was talking about how the Lakers told him that with his toe injury, hey, relax, take your time. We don't need you yet. And in doing so, to make his point, he grabbed my foot out of the pool and started, like, massaging my foot. And I'm just like, all right. There's another moment that, like, most people probably will never experience, and it's something that's just, it's minor, but it's funny. It's just kind of one of those immediate snapshots or whatever. And then, like, there's just other times where I'm sitting back and I'm watching a game, like I was watching the 06 finals, and I just found myself on the screen by accident. And it's not that I forgot that I was there, but it just because I was watching it all differently because I was watching it on TV for maybe the first or second time. And it just makes me say, holy, like, I've done overall just some really cool stuff. And I don't know if, if I missed out on other parts of my life because I was so, like, driven and focused on sports and work and, like, but, I don't mind that. I mean, I still got a lot of living to go. So it's just, I think a lot of it, if I were to, like, think about it, I could say, man, like, that was a pretty cool moment. But I would say in totality, like, just all of it, like the fact that, somebody walking into a bar a couple of years ago told me that meeting me was, like, on her bucket list or something. And I was just like, what world am I living in? So I guess all of it is just it's kind of pinched me, if you will.
But, like that Shaq story, how do you build those relationships as a reporter with these players? Because I'm sure you don't want to bother them too much in certain ways, but then, you need to get your story. So talk about building relationships with guys like that.
That's a good question. I think that's probably, for me, going in was the most challenging thing, or at least the thing I thought about the most, because I was never wanting to be one of those intrusive types, right? It was the one part about being a reporter that didn't seem to fit me, is, like, I wasn't the nosy gossip. But that's kind of what you're supposed to be as a reporter, right? Like, you're supposed to get in people's business. And so my way of doing that was essentially letting my work speak for itself, or letting me speak for myself, and just how I carry myself, and, the work that I do, and just in conversations with them, just being a person, not saying that I always have to schmooze and, say, hey, how are your kids and all that stuff, just so that they think that I'm human, but just again, be myself, be a professional, of course, but be myself, and I personally don't, this is going to sound really conceited. I'm hard to not like, like, I don't mean to say that, like, everybody loves me. I mean, like, very few people hate me. And so I feel like if I'm just myself, and these guys recognize that, and I think that gets some of their respect, right? But a lot of it does come from the work. And so if Joe Schmo comes in, he's only been in the business for 3 years, comes into a locker room as a cool guy and seems like he's being genuine, that doesn't mean that Jimmy Butler is gonna give him good stuff, because he doesn't know yet. Like, he doesn't know whether he can trust him yet. And the other part about that is when guys, they don't want to waste their best stuff. They want to know it's going to be heard. And so if they have something to say, they're probably going to reach out to a guy, Woj, or somebody that's going to get it out there. So times have changed in that respect. But just in terms of, getting players respect, I think that's just the way you have to do it. I was never, even Shaq, for example, was a guy that I tried to figure that out. Like, I was like, man, this is a mega star. To me, he felt like the biggest star on the planet coming into my lap, and, like, how am I going to do this? And so I remember initially doing something really corny, like almost saying to him, like, hey, come on, like, I'm going to be your guy, right? Not that ridiculous, but I remember him essentially telling me, yeah. But then there was one time where I just had to do my job, and, he didn't like the story that I wrote, and it had something to do with Eddie Jones. I don't remember the details. But that was it. Like he said, we're done. And I was like, okay, well, this isn't that type of, this is, it's stupid, So I just said, all right, well, clearly a few days later we were talking again. So, it's not really, the way to go is just go about your business. And there will be guys that you get along with better, that you can ask certain questions of. And there will be guys that you're just not going to be able to touch. LeBron James is somebody that you don't really get close to him. You get close to the people around him. And then, you possibly get close to him, at least at this stage of his career. And so, it just takes a lot of effort and maintaining those relationships. It has to be high on your priority list. Let's put it that way.
So, Izzy, what should journalists do to, put them apart from the other competition? Because journalism today, in 2020, where media is at everybody's fingertips, there's a lot more competition that goes into it.
It's such a difficult question because, and you and I talked before we did this, and so you already know some of this, but if you really look at some of the bigger names in sports media, some of the bigger sports personalities, whether it be anything from sideline reporters to, big time opinionists or whatever, and look at their path, because this whole TV sports media thing has blown up, I would say in the last 20 years, maybe. There weren't it's not made up of a lot of people that said, that's what I'm going to do. I want to chase that goal. And they're doing right. Somebody like Mike Green. Yeah. I mean, that's his craft. He worked at it. He said, I'm going to do that. And he's doing it. But people who are in jobs that weren't around 25, 30 years from now, you're around the horn jobs, the opinionist jobs, the Stephen A. Smith, the first take, those weren't there and available. The only things I can think of way back in the day is the Monday Night Football booth was a place people wanted to go, and again, the play-by-play and color analysts and stuff like that. But there's so many more jobs that are desirable now. And, and if you're good at just offering an opinion, you can create a television show. All that stuff wasn't around necessarily before. So it's tough to say what to do or because not only did we all follow certain paths, but the picture is changing. The goalposts are moving all the time. And so the one thing that I try to advise is, I think we're leaning toward because everything you say is going to get vetted. Everything, is going to get fact checked. You're going to get picked apart left and right. You just have to be really, really thorough. You have to be really, well self-taught. You have to be informed. You can't get caught by surprise. I think there's so many moments where a guy like Stephen A can get away with having the guy who didn't even play on a team and saying he's playing on that team and just brush it off because he's got such a track record. But if you're going to come up in this era when everything is examined and parsed, you have to be above reproach almost. And, I think of guys or people like Bomani Jones, who, he goes at you hard, but it's hard to get him with anything because he comes armed with information and, a talented debate tactics, I guess. And so somebody like Mina Kimes, who it's not an easy place. It's still not an easy place for women to work. And for her to be an expert in football, NFL football, and to, excel in that, she has to be, she cannot be questioned. And I think that, and as difficult as that sounds, that is the primary advice for me, is whatever field you choose or whatever, whether it be one specific sport or whether it be, a broadcast or writing, just know that you can't really fake it. You've got to be really good. You've got to be thorough and just got to dive in. And it's going to take, and I think now, because you have to be more versatile, I remember when Mina first came to Around the Horn, she would give the shortest answers. And I was so worried for her. I was like, no, Mina, we got to go longer. And now she's great. She's amazing. And you can sort of mold yourself, but you definitely have to take the time and the effort and just have to be committed.
To get to ESPN or a big company like that, how much does luck go into that stuff and timing with who you meet?
I said this all the time. Like I was 100% right place, right time, no matter where. And I'll tell you, I'll give you examples all along the way. Like I mentioned the LeBron example. If LeBron signs with Chicago, I don't think ESPN comes calling for me. I don't know that to be true. I could just I could be lying, but or it could be wrong. But that's one of them. When I was at the intern that preceded me, I won't say his name. He's not in the field, so I have no idea where he went. But they hated him. He was arrogant. He turned down stories left and right, and he just didn't want to work hard. He was a student at a very prestigious journalism school in the Midwest. That's all I'll say. And I followed him. I was the very next intern in the sports department, and I was doing any assignment they gave me, trying to come up with more work to do, and doing a pretty good job at it. And so that timing, like I could have followed an amazing intern and not looked as good. I followed that guy, and they gave me a job before I graduated college. So that's one example. And this one's almost more literal, right place, right time. But when the Miami Heat job opened up with the Miami Herald, and I was still at the Palm Beach Post, there was the main sports editor, the executive sports editor, his name was Richard Bush, and then there was a deputy sports editor, George Rojas. And it just so happened that they needed to fill that position quickly, and the executive sports editor was on vacation and could not do the interview. And so the deputy sports editor, George Rojas, did the interview. And I was hired before the executive sports editor got back from his vacation. And I got a little bit of attitude from him initially, and I wondered why. And I found out a few months later that he had said he wouldn't have hired me if he was not on vacation, that I would not have been his choice. And so, thankfully, I made him, sort of eat his words a little bit. He didn't last much longer, by the way. I lasted much longer than he did. He was let go at some point. But yeah, it was that was absolutely right place, right time, and a lot of luck. And so I think a lot of that happens. I don't think it's like, I don't want people to think that it's all luck. I mean, you've got to hustle. You've got to create that. You got to put yourself in that position, because if LeBron had come to Miami and I was a struggling beat writer, they weren't going to come after me, So it's a lot of luck, but you got to put yourself in that spot.
And Israel, what about nerves? When in the field did you have nerves, and how did you overcome them? 20 years into this field, do you still experience those nerves?
This is my approach all the time, and I think I think most people will tell you the same, is there's only one way to combat nerves, and that's just preparation. Like, if you are ready to do what you're going to do, then you have nothing to be nervous about. And so this is why, when you combine that thinking along with the idea that first impressions are very important, this is why I tend to try to really kill it the first show I do, whether it be sports reporters, around the horn, sideline reporting, because both of those reasons, right? It takes the nerves away when you're super prepared, and they're going to ask you back if they like you right off the bat. And so I remember the night before my first sideline reporting gig, I was freaking out. Like I remember saying to myself, man, I've watched these games for decades, right? And everything goes smoothly. Like, it's totally, looks like it's the easiest thing in the world. And now I have to be partially responsible for making that look smooth. And what if I have a brain fart? Like, what if this happens? What if that happens? And then I just said to myself, I just started thinking about all of the ESPN interviews I've done live on the fly. I started thinking about what the job entails. And I said to myself, if I forgot everything I was going to say, would I be able to BS my way through 60 seconds? I'll be like, yeah, I've got that depth of knowledge where I can do that. And so it calmed me down. And then I realized, I was super ready for a game between the Nuggets and the Celtics, which wasn't really going to be watched that much by that many. So, yeah, I think that's the only way to combat nerves to me, is just prepare yourself, and then you won't have anything to be nervous about.
And what are mistakes you've made in your career that you wish you could have done differently?
I have a few, but a couple of them are just like more recent slash modern regrets. Like I regret not establishing myself on social media earlier, and then having like a consistent approach to it. I'm at the point now where I'm just kind of it's a lot of effort, and I could have to sort of rebrand myself or try to be more active on there. And I wish I would have done something differently there, especially now because it's just so important. Regret. I turned down the New York Times a couple of times, and I don't regret it because obviously things turned out great, but I wonder if it would have hardened me a little bit more to work out of New York. I just didn't like the idea of living there, and just the circumstances weren't perfect either. But that's something that I wonder, again, not regret, but I wonder if things would have happened a little bit differently. I regret not being sort of more declarative in what I want to do, because as much as I was happy about reaching that goal of being an NBA beat writer after 10 months after graduating, it sort of left me in this place where I didn't set goals anymore because I didn't know what was possible. I thought, just let things happen, and clearly things have been going well so far, so why not just go that route? But it also, at a certain point, sort of leaves you a little helpless, right? Because you don't have a plan and you don't have a goal to sort of reach, and you're just kind of sitting around and waiting for things to motivate you, or trying to find things to motivate you. So, man, felt like I was talking in circles there. What was the initial question?
I mean, you pretty much answered everything. Mistakes you've made, and what you regret.
Yeah.
But Izzy, I got a question for you. Why not? You kind of mentioned a little bit. Why not the Times? You said the move, but where were you in your career that you didn't want to take that one?
First time it was a weird and then it was a weird language issue, right? I was being interviewed, I thought, to cover basketball, and the way it was explained to me is I would just cover the Nets, the N as in Nancy, the Nets, right? At the time, the New Jersey Nets, who were not nearly as important as the Knicks. They were always the second team over there, or it seemed like it anyway. But there still had to be some shuffling to be done because some writer who was covering the Knicks needed to go to the NBA column, but then the NBA column beat had to. So it was like some maneuvering that had to happen, right? But still, when they offered me the job, I thought they were offering me the job of covering the Nets.
I think I know where you're going here.
Yeah, they pivoted and they offered me the New York Metropolitans beat writer job, the Mets, as in mommy. And even though I'd covered baseball, covering the Mets in New York is a different animal. Covering baseball in New York is a different animal. And I didn't think I was ready for a move from covering the sport that I love to covering a sport that I didn't love as much in a place that's a lot less forgiving and would just dominate my time. Like absolutely, like from 2 p.m. till midnight, like you are at a ballpark every single day. And they, the idea was, hey, this is just to get you in. And that's the New York Times pitch to whoever they interview, it feels like, is you might come in as our soccer writer, you might leave as our Egyptian correspondent, so it could be anything. But yeah, I just didn't feel that. I wasn't feeling it. And then when they finally did offer me the Knicks beat job, I had just gotten the columnist gig at the Herald, and I didn't want to go backward from columnist to beat writer. And so I was just like, yeah, that was a little bit too late. And so, yeah, didn't work out.
And Izzy, tell me about your relationship with Dan Liebetard on Highly Questionable on ESPN.
I think I mentioned this earlier. I read him in high school. It's not to date him too much. He was super young when he started at the Miami Herald. I think he's only like 50, 51 now. And I'm turned 43 this week. So I read him a ton. I remember when I first started writing, writing features and columns for the student newspaper at school. I remember saying to myself, "Don't try to write like Dan." Right? It was because Dan's too good. Like he's got to, and if I try to do that, it's not going to sound very good. It's not going to sound like it's me. But he was the style of writing that was always in my head because I read him all the time, and so. that was sort of how he was sort of in my consciousness all the time. And then when I got to the Herald, didn't really see him a ton. Like, I think we would like speak at games, at any big games. He'd come to write a column at. I remember being at the Herald, I believe, while he took his little hiatus. So he took a sabbatical or something. He was away from journalism altogether. I think it was right before he started the radio show. And so he was only, even like when I was the columnist, and he was only around every once in a while. So we didn't have like a great relationship. But he was always a person that if I ever talked to, it felt like he was not only willing to listen, but wanting to listen and offer, some advice. And so in a way, you're closer to Dan than you actually are, it feels like. At least that's my experience. And so I remember when I was struggling with, coming out and how I would do it and everything else. And I remember just going to talk to Dan, and I didn't even know what I was going to ask him. Like, I just remember I was just blah, 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 like talking in circles. And he's like, whoa, buddy, like, what is it that you want? Like, and I'm like, I don't know, man. I guess I just never really talked about this stuff. And so he's just been sort of a steadying person, not even like steadying in a sense, but he just has a way of putting things in perspective, and just as, a good human being. And like the fact that, he's been on this, he's had this radio show down here, and like me being affiliated with it in any way is, an honor. And it's just really cool to have people around the country just kind of talk to you. And like, it's sort of the outlet. Dan has been sort of the outlet to let my personality show through, like my actual real who I am personality, as opposed to just the one that, people see on like outtakes of Around the Horn or something. And so he's just, he's just been a real, whether he has actually physically been there or not, he's just been a real steady force in my life, and just a really good guy.
Yeah, I remember when I spoke to you on the phone a couple weeks ago, just talking journalism, talking my career and stuff like that. He came in with the FaceTime call. You remember that? He came in with the FaceTime call. He was on one of the shows. So he's obviously a good friend. Who are some other friends you got in the field who, you go to for advice and, just who you hang out with?
Yeah, man, there's so many of them. Like going back to my college days, like the friends that, I don't have to see them for 3 years, but every time I do, it's like they never left. There's an Andrea Adelson who she works for ESPN.com. She covers college football for us. Mark Long, who works out of Gainesville for the Associated Press, covers the Jags and the Gators. Tim Reynolds down here in Miami for the Associated Press has been a great friend of mine for years. George Sedano, Jamel Hill, Tony Reale has been, I've had, I would say I probably have never cried as much on the phone with another human being as I did one time with Tony Reale a few years back. So that's just like, it's crazy how, it just, I don't know if it's the similarities in the jobs or, everything that we have in common because of these odd jobs that we have. But there's a closeness that develops there. And, Pablo and Mina have lately been, Pablo Torre and Mina Kimes have lately been people that I just, again, even though you don't talk to them or see them as often as you'd like, there's just sort of a connection there. I feel like, really get along with them a lot as well. So yeah, Clinton Yates is, just too many to name.
How fun is being on television? I remember in a Halloween 2018 episode of Around the Horn, you dressed as, Tony Reale, you just mentioned, The Rock, Obama, Drake, and Israel, my favorite, Conor McGregor. Tell me about that day and, putting on all that makeup and the McGregor hair, the beard, and the accent, everything. Tell me about that.
So the whole Around the Horn experience on Halloween was just nutty. The first time I did it, it was in 2012, and it was an election year. And, they basically just ask every year, hey, who wants to be on the Halloween episode? And what's your idea? So that first year, I was like, I can do Obama. People think I look like Obama all the time. And so we came with this idea. And I'm not really like an impression guy, so I just tried to get a couple of like a little bit of the cadence and stuff. And they had this brilliant idea of me bringing somebody that could be like my Secret Service, and so I had my baldest friend come in, and he sort of just put on a black suit and pretended to be Secret Service. And it wasn't really that it was that great, right? Because, and this is actually something I tell some people, I don't know why people don't listen. They say that I won like 7 Halloweens in a row. No, I didn't. I didn't win the first one. They remember me from the first one, but Tim Kalishaw won the first one as the ghost of Al Davis. And so I just remember thinking this, and this is probably like the holy bleep, I'm on TV moment, like where it actually happened was I said to myself, I remember like growing up watching Saturday Night Live, and even though I'm not doing a Saturday Night Live skit or any sort of good impression of the president, I am on TV impersonating the president for the whole country to see. Like, that doesn't happen, right? And so to everyday people. And so that was when I was just like, man, that's crazy. And then the Halloween stuff, just from then, I was never really a Halloween person, but the next year I did Justin Bieber, and that went along very well because he was at a Heat game dressed a certain way one year, so I just did the exact same thing. Then you start upping the ante, and when you get to the Conor McGregor one, like I didn't think I could do any better than that, because that was the one where I actually worked a little bit on the accent. I probably like 2 weeks ahead of time started listening to stuff, and then the day of just listened to nothing but McGregor interviews. But it took 7 hours to get those tattoos done. It took, and that was just a friend of mine just drawing them on me. Her name was Marcy. She did help me out a lot over the years with these costumes. And then I had another person come in and just do the hair and the makeup. Once I was in that makeup and looked like that, I was like, man, I can't screw this up. Like, it's impossible. This looks too good. And so I just, kept the accent rolling, and it was fun. It was a ton of fun. So they were all crazy, and just, the being on TV thing, like, I think, that moment with the president impersonation, and also, whenever I say anything like impactful about the LGBT community, and like people come up to me afterward and say, hey, I saw that, and it meant a lot. Like, the reach that TV has, I think, is something that, can't be duplicated. And so whenever you feel the reach, when you go to a random place and somebody says something, that meant that you said something that meant something to them, I think that's when you sort of recognize it. Man, that's what that feels like. That's a really cool thing.
Spurs legend Gregg Popovich. I saw a YouTube clip of you interviewing him on the sidelines.
Popovich, Greg, you did better than the three-point defense in this third quarter, but what's been the biggest problem defending the Lakers so far?
Our biggest problem is that we're playing a pitiful game. They've got good edge. They want the game. They're playing well, and we're pitiful.
How do you change that in the fourth?
25 seconds on the clock.
Give me a break.
What's the preparation for Pop? Because he's got to be one of the hardest interviews of all time, because he either gives you a lot or he gives you nothing at all. So tell me your preparation for Pop.
It's interesting because, you go in the first few times I was super intimidated by him. But I think my favorite sort of evolution with Pop is just the pregame meetings, right? So the broadcast team will always talk to both coaches before the games. And we all get a chance to ask our questions, the play-by-play guy, the color guy, and the reporter. And I could sort of see Pop sort of gaining respect for me as the time has gone along, from 2013 until, a couple of years back, where I realized that, like, he recognizes that I know my stuff. He appreciates the questions that I ask pregame, right? And he also appreciates the question I asked during game. Reason being, he wants them to be as plain as possible. He wants them to be open-ended. He wants them to have not much thought involved for him, because he's got to think about what he's going to do in the timeout, and this is not something he's fond of. It's clear. He says it a lot. And so it does take more effort to consider the question, because you also don't want to ignore something obvious, right? If there was a segment or a play in that quarter that the coach can't answer, I mean, you got to ask it. You can't just, avoid it because it's Gregg Popovich and have him intimidate you. So you've definitely got to pay attention to that. But if there's not an obvious question, and this is more difficult in first quarters when you're interviewing him, you've got to find a way to come up with two open-ended, generic questions that are not the same and that he will not mock. And, it became a little easier as we went because there was a little bit of a vibe between him and I. He kind of knew what to expect. I haven't done his games in about a year and a half now, any of his games. So it's got a little pop withdrawal, but I actually appreciate him a lot. Like, I have a ton of respect for him. I think, there was one point where he said it's been a pleasure after our interviews, and he wasn't like being sarcastic. And so I'm a fan of Pop. He's like, he's, I don't know, like an uncle I didn't know I had.
And Israel, what about commitment in the journalism field, especially as a sideline reporter and working for the NBA? So flying and missing some events, maybe some family things. Christmas, I've seen you do Christmas games. Talk to me about that in the journalism field.
I mean, it's a sacrifice. I never missed Christmas with my family until, whenever it was that the Heat became relevant. And then I had to do some Christmas games, whether it was as a beat writer or as a, then doing the NBA sidelines and stuff. And, to me, it's an experience. You can recreate the other stuff, right? Like, I'd always do an Ismas for whenever I'd have to miss Christmas. I'd just do another one at my place. And, I'd give, and, the kids would all be told that Santa dropped the presents off at my place and we had to do a redo. And so you can recreate all that other stuff. And there's nothing that, like, I don't do it because, hey, it's going to be around forever, but those games are going to be around forever. And it's kind of cool that, that I get to be a part of some of them.
So Israel, we haven't talked too much NBA here. So what are your thoughts on the NBA returning to the Disney bubble and who you got winning it all?
I'm hopeful it will go off without a hitch. I do think there's going to be moments of trepidation where Adam's going to have to decide whether they need to continue. I think there's going to be at least one or two of those. And I think one of them is going to come up in this early portion when the players start arriving and the tests start rolling in. And everybody's going to have to be reminded, hey, this is the reason we're doing this. This is why there's going to be a quarantine process. This is why we have the test, because there will be positives and we want to just make sure it's cleared out as soon as we find them. So I do think that's going to happen. And hopefully, it's crazy to think that you have to say this because we're just doing these things for money, but hopefully nobody gets severely ill and that we regret ever doing this, because that's going to be a terrible look when we examine why exactly we're doing this, if we are forced to examine that because of somebody's, severe illness or worse. So hopefully it all goes without a hitch. Either the Clippers or the Bucks are going to win a championship if they finish it. It's not that I don't think, I just think defensively they're going to, they've got the right combination of defense, 3-point shooting, and depth. And I don't know if everything's going to be the same. You don't know which players are going to be around. Everything's going to be crazy. But assuming everything's normal as it can be, I'd say Bucks Clippers final, and I'd probably say the Bucks win it. You're the first person that asked me just that question. Everybody's only asked me about when we're coming back. Are you going? I literally have not even put that much thought into who I think is going to win it. The only thing I remember thinking about one time was when Chris Mannix said that the Sixers are going to get out of the East, and he gave a bunch of reasons why, and I was like, oh, I don't think that's going to happen. But the first time I ever picked a champion. Wow. I surprised myself.
And lastly, you have 1 hour to interview anybody in history. Who are you picking?
Oh, dead or alive?
Dead or alive?
Man, I feel like this question changes, or this answer would change all the time. But the first one that comes to mind is John F. Kennedy. I had a bit of an obsession, not really an obsession, but, a minor version of an obsession with JFK and, his biography. And I just read a bunch about him. And I just think there's just so much interest there. It's funny because the first thing in my mind was I thought you were going to say a sports figure, and I would assume alive, and that answer would have been Serena. But man, any figure at all, dead or alive, I gotta go JFK. Although there's some people like I'm very much intrigued by Shoeless Joe Jackson, but I don't think the interview would be very good. because he was reportedly kind of a dummy. So I don't think he would be on that list. But I guess I'll stick to JFK for now.
All right, folks, that's it. We'll take JFK from Israel. Maybe, whenever that may be, if we could time travel or something like that. Ladies and gentlemen, ESPN reporter Israel Gutierrez. Israel, thanks for taking the time. I really appreciate you giving, everybody listening the advice, because there'll be a lot of young journalists listening.
My pleasure, Mikey.
All right, thank you.
All right, brother. That was
Israel.
fun.